This is Thrive Perspectives, an ever-growing discussion about the issues and ideas that shape our lives, with your guide, Dr. Matthew Jacoby.
Good morning, Matt. Good morning, Connell.
Morning.
Here we are. Here we are. It's actually a public holiday today, and we are in here anyway, bright and early in the morning, and we are digging into the next edition of Thrive Perspectives as we look at the Christian worldview. And we came up with a bit of a list of topics, and this was the next one we thought would be really good to broach in our discussion. And the question we sort of posed is, how can Christians respond to questions about the historical accuracy and reliability of the Bible in an age of skepticism and scientific discovery? So that's kind of where I thought we'd head today, lads.
Well, I can only really say how I would respond to questions about those sort of issues, but that's a start. And it is something that comes up a fair bit. It's, I guess, we kind of put up the Bible as the foundation of our faith, and so naturally, questions get asked about the Bible, about the accuracy, and so forth.
Totally, and I think important to recognise that the Bible is, and probably no one will be surprised by this, the most popular book of all time. There's over 100 million copies of the Bible sold every year, or given away. So printed and given away in third world countries. 100 million copies every single year. So, it's a good question to ask.
Yeah. I think it's good to start just with a bit of broad context around what we think about the Bible and about, I guess, the foundation of our faith in any case. Because sometimes these sorts of arguments can be kind of straw man arguments that I find they're attacking something that I don't even actually really believe. You know what I mean? Yeah. So, it's, for example, when people say, talk about, the Bible and science debates and the Bible's scientifically inaccurate because, it affirms a, flat earth and a dome and it's like, yeah, but they're just working with the way that they saw things, and
it's not a science.
And it's not that, it's actually not affirming that, it's just kind of operating within the way that they saw the world. So it's not a science book. So I think that's a example of where, I guess, just a misunderstanding of what we even think anyway. And those kinds of approaches tend to eclipse what is actually the real beauty and the profundity of texts like, Genesis, 1 and 2, for example, which has at so many levels is just such an amazing piece of literary profundity. Really, it's from a literary point of view, from a theological point of view, it's so incredibly rich. And some of those questions, when you expect it to do something that it's not even out to do in the first place, it actually prevents us from seeing the real genius of the text. It's the same with, when you come somewhat similar to when you come to, for example, the historical narratives. Now, we do affirm that there is historicity behind that, because so I think it does matter that certain things happened in history, because God acting in history is a very core part of the biblical faith. We're not, we don't believe in a just a distant God, and here are some stories that illustrate timeless truths. They do illustrate timeless truths, but actually part of our faith is that no, God has actually done things in history, and those set up kind of a covenant precedence for us today, 2,000, 3,000, even 4,000 years later. So we are affirming that the Bible tells us things about history, but the way that history is told is not like a history book that's written today. It's heavily theological in nature, and that takes, we have to just have a different approach to those books. It's not that what they're saying didn't happen, but the way that they're reporting it is this kind of this prophetic approach. So these books are put together with a theological agenda. I mean, this is evident already in the Gospels, where you've got 4 gospel writers. We'll even take the synoptic Gospels, which is Matthew, Mark, and Luke. are ordering events of Jesus' life. They're aware of each other, but they're ordering things differently. But they're totally okay with that, and yet they're still saying, "And then Jesus did this, and then he did this." But they're organising things topically and the events in a way that serves their particular theological purpose
and the audience that they're addressing.
That's right. And then you've got John, who's conscious already that, well, the other gospel's already there. I'll provide some extra, so he's, so it's a lot more theological and
so they're not writing historical
records.
Like a academic, like a textbook or even they're not even trying to be historians.
That's right. They're theologians, and when it comes to like the Old Testament narratives, I mean, they're expressly prophetic in nature. They actually refer to official court records all the time. It's interesting to note all the footnotes through the books of Samuel and Kings. The other events of Kings such and such are recorded in the annals of the kings of Israel and Judah. So they're footnoting that, but they're not. That's not what they're providing. They're drawing from those records, to bring a message from God, essentially.
And it's not that they're not historically not valuable either, because I think they are recognised as some of the most important historical records.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
because there wasn't a lot of, especially if you go back thousands of years ago, there wasn't a lot of sort of formal record keeping, and so it is actually still recognised as one. Forget even the theological in the biblical part of it, but as far as actual historical records, they are still viewed as some of the most important historical works from the time. But I guess the point is, when they were written, it wasn't to communicate historical facts, even though they do that, but that wasn't the main point that was going to be drawn out of it. It was meant to communicate theological. That took precedence over it. So,
that's right.
So, if you look at it purely from historical reporting perspective, there may be, as you say, things that are reorganized in order to bring out the theological point, clearer.
Yeah, that's right. And so I guess that's the first thing to keep in mind, and that's just some broad comments about that. The other thing is, I guess, the nature of faith, and there's, I guess, there's a tendency, particularly in the sort of post-Enlightenment period, for kind of, or for faith to be seen as faith in a kind of like an object or a body of propositions, or and so it's sometimes portrayed as though our faith is in the Bible, when actually, our faith is in Christ. Who is the embodied Word of God, and yes, it's Christ reported through Scripture, but I think there's an important difference, because there's this kind of way of thinking that wants to make faith into almost this kind of, I sit back, I have this object, this body of propositions here. We kind of study that, and is this worthy of being an object of belief? Is this a believable thing? That account of belief is a very kind of post-Enlightenment account of belief. It's not actually really what faith is. And one of the problems with that is that then we go looking for something that's like, is this believable? So what do we do then? We apply the scientific method, because, like particularly from the Enlightened period onward, that becomes the sort of authoritative method of ascertaining whether something is true or not. One of the problems with that method is that it's based on falsification. And there's plenty of critique of the sort of almost the sort of totalitarian nature of that theory, that the scientific method is the only way you can verify any truth claim at all. Yes. That's the scientific method applies to certain sorts of things, but it's not the only way in which we know the truth. So that kind of there's that need then to establish this sort of pristine object that is, in some senses, cannot be doubted. You know what I mean? And so I think there's a certain kind of skepticism that emerges out of that, which has come from this kind of scientific attack essentially on the Bible and this endless process of falsification. And there's more to say about this, but the problem is that when you start with doubt, everything can be doubted, right? Everything can be doubted. And when you start with the process of falsification, there's this essentially the approach is it's guilty until it's proven innocent. It's always possible to doubt. It's, well, did this really happen? Well, we have doubts and we haven't so just with certainty, verified.
Just explain what you mean by the process of falsification. So instead of starting from a position, we have no evidence either way.
Yeah.
So instead of believing it's true until we can prove it to be false, we're believing it's false until we can prove it to be true.
That's right. Yeah.
Yep.
Which is how science generally works.
Yeah, that's right.
Set out to falsify it.
That's right. So you set up a thesis and then you set about falsifying it. And if it stands up with it. Now that works well for science. The problem, and this is applied to history somewhat as well. Now the problem is it starts, history is a funny sort of discipline because you get these constant revisions of history with another generation of scholars, and the next generation of scholars is going to take the previous generation to task, and it has a tendency to go in circles because it's partly this sort of institutional process, methodological process where I'm going to critique and challenge what the last generation said. You're not going to get a PhD unless you do that. Really, it's kind of built into the academy in a sense. You can't just sort of accept it. That there was an older approach is that there's a degree of authority to something that's inherited from the past. If something's been, this is this traditionalist sort of view that if it comes from the past, there's a degree of authority because it's weathered, it's weathered, the eons of time. And so,
well, even that's really challenged now because we view the past as they were all sort of ignorant back then. And
yeah, that's right. And so we apply and we apply what's known as a hermeneutic of suspicion. Now, this is it's guilty until proven innocent because we just assume everyone's lying, everyone's corrupt.
And what would they know anyway?
Yeah, and look, there's reason for that. And as Christians, we get that with human sin and there's plenty of corruption. We're not denying that.
But they don't have access to all the wealth of knowledge that we have today as well. That would be the view. We've got the scientific method. We know so much more about how things work and the way that everything's advanced, philosophy and science. Everything's completely changed how we understand sort of everything.
Yeah. One of the problems is, so while that method works in terms of just the practical results of it works in some fields. The problem is when you're looking for a foundation to actually make a decision, a process of endless doubt never leads to a point where, now we know. It's once you start, how you begin determines where you end up. And so that process of falsification never really ends. You know what I mean? So, if we go back to, views on, some ancient empire or some ancient figure and the continual revisions of scholars kind of rethinking that. But you never get to a sense of.
It never resolves.
No,
itself.
It never really resolves, right? No. And so it just goes round and round and round in circles. And so, well, we can never know. Now, again, this is the problem with this approach. And you see this, for example, in historical events. There's this approach called archaeological minimalism, which says that unless we find real tangible evidence for an event, then it didn't happen. Okay. So, for a long time, it was doubted that the whole David thing that was seen as being a fabrication, and David was probably, I think a lot of people doubted whether he even existed, and if he did, he was probably just a unimportant local chieftain, right?
Or even the city of Jerusalem being what it was.
Yeah, that's
time.
right.
It was just a village, basically.
And because and so they just assumed that wasn't, was all a fabrication. And of course, then they found evidence that actually, the house of David and the importance of the house of and now they're saying, oh no, actually David was an important, leader, in the ancient world. Now, there's an example. If you've got a whole, like this, generations of people. Oh, yeah, David either didn't exist or was just a local chieftain, wasn't really a king as the Bible puts it. And then, of course, finally we do find something, and then everyone say, "Oh, no, actually, sorry, no, actually was pretty important."
Yeah.
Same, it was the same thing with Solomon. That, there was this similar view about Solomon, that he wasn't as wealthy as, probably. And now, the last probably 15 years, they've new discoveries down in the copper mines right in the south of Israel have verified the fact that, oh no, actually he was actually quite as important as it indicates.
And the reasons they would have doubted those things were probably reasonable. To an extent.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, but they're based on this falsification. So we don't have tangible evidence of the fact this was the case. So we're going to assume that it wasn't. That's, are we going to assume that this is just a puffed up account?
It's a myth.
Yeah, or it's some kind of myth. Now, you see there's a problem with that approach, because it never allows us to, if we take that approach, we're just operating out of doubt. And the problem from a Christian point of view is that the departure point for us is a departure point of faith. And with a lot of this criticism about the Bible, that sort of takes this almost, I'm standing back and I'm poking holes in the Bible. There's a relationship there that is actually, this is not the way that I relate to the Bible. And I think this is, as I reflect on this and as I read books by the skeptics and so forth, and there are problems with those, I think there are lots of problems with those books, because sometimes I guess your approach determines what you see and find as well. Totally. That's another thing.
You can see the obvious bias in there. I've tried to get to the bottom of this myself, reading the skeptics and listening to what are the best reasons to actually believe the Bible isn't what it claims to be. Not so much because I don't want to believe it, but because I always want to feel like I've exposed myself to the best arguments. Yeah. I'm not arriving at this as a point of ignorance in myself, because that's often an accusation that's made anyway to Christians, that you just don't know, you're just assuming it, you've never really had it challenged. So, and whenever I've gone down that path, I'll start with what I think are those best arguments, and then as you kind of read the response and the criticism of it, it opens up so many more questions, and before you know it, you're into like conspiracy theories and all sorts of theories about the different dynamics that were at play with each of the, like take the apostles or Paul, and what was his relationship to the Jewish authorities, and what was he really trying to do? Who was he really trying to, and there's all these kinds of scenarios that are just thrown up. At times I kind of mapped it out and tried to think through all it, and it just like is just this tree of ideas and criticisms that just opens up, and it just gets bigger and bigger,
and it just muddies the waters. Yeah,
and you never resolve it. And at the end of the day, all I've got is a whole collection of theories about what this person could have been doing or what they really meant, and I've kind of stepped back from it because I can't actually resolve it.
Yeah. So let's try for a biblical worldview, because this is what this is about, a biblical worldview of the Bible. I mean,
exactly.
Here's a good idea. So when I read the Bible, I'm reading this as someone that's inside this, like I'm part of this, in a sense, this flow, this historical flow that we refer to as the kingdom of God. Like God is at work in the world. How do I know that? I know because he's at work in my life, right? Because what I read in Isaiah from 700 BC is exactly what is at work in my life. Like I feel like it's almost contemporaneous. I can read something that was written 700 BC, and this God that pleads with his people is the same God that's pleading with me in my heart. I mean, it's this level of connection and contemporaneousness with the. It's not like this object that I'm looking at from this external point of view. I'm reading this and I'm hearing the voice of God speaking to me through this, and so there's this almost immediate connection that I have with the truth of this. When I read the words of Paul, it's like he is in this same experience that I'm having. Now he's way ahead and he's leading the way and he's guiding me, and so there's this sense in which we as Christians, we belong to this let's refer to it as this kind of historical movement or this flow, this family even. I mean, it's a family that stretches right back to Abraham, and a family that has been responding to God very fallibly, but responding to God as God has acted in their lives. And I read about Abraham, it's like, I know this God. This is the God that is active in my life. And I can read those stories, and that becomes important historical precedents. The promises to Abraham are promises to me. And I walk in those promises, and I see that God is faithful to those promises. Year to year, I look back and see God is faithful to those promises. So there's this immediacy to my engagement. The Bible is not an object for me. Right. It is a living tradition. And when I use the word tradition, I mean that in the best possible sense. Yeah. And that the idea is a little countercultural, because anything that belongs to tradition, because in modern society, it's all, I guess, we're ruled by the idea of progress, and we're moving forward, and the past is all wrong, and we're moving forward and getting it more and more right. That even within philosophy is being challenged. That there's this idea that there are intuitive, and there's a school of philosophy known as perennialism or traditionalism, which challenges that, which says, well, there are things handed down through the past that are intuitive with human nature, that perhaps we've lost touch with some of those intuitions. And so we need to go back to the past outside of our so-called progress, because there are problems with our relationship to reality now with the modern mind. Yep. It's so buffered. It's so sort of alienated in a sense. This is the criticism, that we can benefit by going back to these, ancient writings and reading writings from people who are much more porous to reality. I mean, even reading, for example, Upanishads, which is the kind of philosophical body from the Hindu tradition, man, there's a lot of insight there, and a lot of, Paul says, although they knew God in Romans chapter 1, and there's a sense in which when I read the Upanishads, they're really intuiting something. It's very bottom up, and I don't ascribe authority to that, but it's, there's value and merit, and there's truth in what they're saying. So I think all that to say that there's an approach, I think, that makes that idea countercultural, the idea of tradition. Yeah. And so as a Christian, I find myself in continuity with a tradition, with a family that stretches right back to that point. And I read these people having the same, they're in this same stream, and they're leading the way. And so for me, it's about respect for, and this is a very, Christian idea, because, God works through people. He's committed to working through people. We've covered that idea. And so in order to reach people, he does that through people. And so when God wants to reveal himself, he embodies his purposes in a person, let's say Abraham, right? Yeah. And he works in Abraham, and Abraham becomes not just a messenger, but the message in a sense. Abraham's life becomes a prophetic message that then fans out from there, because God works through people. And if God works through people, then that means it's not just in general, that's, not just through humanity, but actual particular people. It has to be specified. Otherwise, it doesn't mean anything. So particular people like Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph and Moses. And so here is this family of faith that's fanning out, and through Christ then becomes this worldwide family of faith that I'm a part of. I'm a part of this stream. So there is this living tradition. It's not just a static object that you stand out, because if you want to find something to critique and doubt, you'll find it. Yeah. You know what I mean? Yeah. And we'll get to specific things in a moment, but I think the big picture here, and just starting from this, is that we're on the inside of this, and that's that level of connection that allows us to recognize the truth of it in a deeper sense, and it's from there, that faith connection with this move of the Spirit through history, that we, in a sense, recognize the truth that we're dealing with. So Jesus refers to this in John chapter 7, where he says, in a slight interpretive paraphrase, if you want to know what I'm saying is true, then do what I say. If you do what I say, then you'll know that my words are true. And I think that's a really good principle.
Yeah, I mean, the Bible's an easy target because if I can prove that the Bible is untrustworthy, that undoes your faith, your confidence. Your doctrine becomes undone. You can't have confidence in the resurrection,
but the method
and so on.
The method can't do. See, this is the thing, because the method can never arrive at certainty.
No,
and so it attacks our certainty, but they can never arrive at certainty that it's untrustworthy either.
Yeah,
because their own method cuts off that possibility.
But what I was going to say is, and we fall for this trap. Because then we kind of can look at that and go, and many Christians have left the faith because of it, is we then think that the reason that I'm a Christian is because of the trustworthiness of the Bible.
That's right, because I've applied historical, critical, scientific method to an object.
I've read it, it's convinced me.
And I'm like, oh yes, and now I'm a Christian.
And then I'm a Christian, right? Yeah. But actually it's the other way.
Yeah.
I'm a Christian because of relationship with God and how he works in your life, and you develop faith in God through that. And then the Bible is there as kind of a light that helps kind of explain, the narrative and the more about who God is and so on. But my faith doesn't rest on the Bible in the way that the critics would want it to.
Yeah.
Now there would be a problem if the Bible actually could be shown to be completely and just completely falsified. That would be an issue. I don't think anyone's actually successful, because there's always arguments and counter arguments, and those who are critiquing it, they don't mean us well when they do it. They're deliberately being very disingenuous.
They're starting with their own agenda.
And very manipulative how they present the so there's all sorts of issues with it, and I've yet to see any kind of compelling reason that the clincher that they would be able. So, but we don't want to fall for the trap of thinking that if they do raise doubts in my mind about certain things that I can't explain, that should therefore translate into a doubt in my faith, because you flipped it all around back to front. It's not actually how it works anyway.
Yeah, that's right. I think it's worth saying something about now the history, just getting inside this a little bit, because all of that said, there are actual reasons, even from an objective point of view, for taking the Bible seriously in its historical claims. But we've just got to deal with the problems of historical method. Let me give you an example. And the famous example is the Exodus, right? A very important historical event, right? Now, applying that method, people are saying, well, we haven't found any evidence of this mass exodus from Egypt, and so therefore, it's not true. But it's like, okay, how are you going to? Essentially, what you've got is a bunch of people living as nomads, wandering through a desert. Now, I've been in that desert. How you find anything? It's like there are a whole lot of reasons why we may not have found evidence. I mean, you're going back 3,500 years, right? And you're trying to find evidence of a nomadic people, who are moving from place to place. They're not building things. They're not, we're not going to have the sort of evidence that you usually have of, civilizations. And so that whole enterprise can be problematic, in that this kind of trying to find evidence for that. Now, I mean, there are some people that claim that they have found evidence for that, but you see that that whole approach. It didn't happen unless we find tangible evidence for it is problematic from that point of view. And yet, like I said, there are plenty of examples where there are things, that we doubted that now they've found evidence for, because archaeology is a very young discipline, and because also it's happening. I mean, even in the Holy Land, where a lot of these events took place. It's actually very recent, really, and it's there's still so much to do. So it's fair, we're at a pretty early stage in terms of what people are finding and historical investigation.
So there's lots of good reason to doubt the doubters.
Yeah, that's right.
Because the doubters are often proven their doubt was sort of unfounded.
Yeah, that's
as more evidence comes along. I mean, it's like even with the Exodus, for example. Like I've heard the criticism there. Well, if the Egyptians were, say, chasing the Israelites and the seas actually opened up and they walked through, for those Egyptians that didn't get drowned, surely there'd be some, it would be just one of the most miraculous things of the day for people who have seen that. Surely that would have been written about in somewhere back in Egyptian history, that they witnessed something like that. But even then, that's kind of like saying, but there's so little records of any kind. From that time.
And they never record, and they didn't record defeats.
No, that's exactly right.
They recorded victories, not defeats.
And the population aren't recording anything. I mean, we think we can write anything down now because we can, but back in those days, there was particular people who were the scribes, so they wrote stuff down and they did what they were told to do.
But I can't remember what the stats were, but the percentage of information, I was reading about it somewhere, the percentage of known information from what we have in the what was probably written down was something like 1%.
Yeah.
And the percentage of that we've actually discovered or found is just, just minuscule. So speaking about anything of absence of evidence, there's plenty of reason to doubt the doubters.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So I think that, there are some complex issues there with the historicity, but I'm fine. I mean, I'm fascinated by the archaeology, and I subscribe to a biblical archaeology magazine that takes a fairly, critical approach, and, it's remarkable the sorts of things that are coming to light. And there's just so much stuff that's validating the historical narratives. That seems to be the trajectory. So I think, getting back to the original question, Stu, about the reliability of the Bible, and often it becomes an argument over, and the word inerrancy is used, trying to find errors in the Bible. Well, if it's got errors, then now,
if it's got one even, it discounts everything.
Yeah, which is a misunderstanding of what we're even what we even think about the Bible. And there's a great Peter Enns in his book Inspiration and Incarnation uses a great simile that I think works. He says the Scripture pretty much is like Jesus in that it's fully divine and fully human. It is the result of a living tradition. People, all the complexities of, scribal traditions and all of that is at work because God, why? Because God works through people and human processes, but to bring about the result that he wants, right? But what you have is a document that bears all the marks of humanity in the sense that it's culturally contingent. It's, it's embedded in history. It has the concerns of history, has a lot of the perspectives of those historical points, has some of the limitations of what people knew or didn't know at the time or so forth. And yet through that, God works through that. And what it is teaching us is that's what we're saying is infallible in that sense, that God is teaching us through this. And when we talk about inerrancy, we're not saying that, all of the grammar is absolutely perfect. All of the,
names are spelt right.
It's, we're saying that what it's asserting is true. And so there are, so for example, with, Genesis 1, we got to ask the question, what is this actually asserting? What is this making claims about? When it says the waters above the skies and, God separated we don't need to say that it's asserting that. It's just operating within an ancient world view that saw, that there were a sort of watery firmament and it's just working with that, what we would, it's describing things phenomenologically, as we would say the sun comes up. So they're just describing the way that they sort of saw things, and they're operating within a ancient Near Eastern cosmology because they're wanting to say all of this is created by God, and they're wanting to correct the theological errors, of their time about the way that people saw reality. So that's a example of where we have to ask the question: no, what is this actually affirming? And let's not a lot of the mistakes.
A whole lot of other stuff.
That's right.
That it isn't
that it's that it's kind of this textbook of all reality. No, it's doing a very specific thing and asserting very specific theological truths. In other words, another way of saying that is that every text has a meaning. It's not just to mean anything. There's a particular reason why it's written and what it's conveying, and that's a theological message. And we assert that message is true, is the truth.
So there's an overarching kind of truth that's in it. I guess where people would struggle is where there are perceived blatant contradictions, because we do treat the Bible as something that we study at an academic level as well. Like, we really drill into the words and what those words really mean. And so we're not just standing back, taking the overall truth that it's trying to tell us, but we place a lot of emphasis on the actual language and the meaning and what the Greek root word of this actually means, and in order to try to establish some kind of doctrinal foundation out of it. And so if there are things that look like just straight out contradictions, then it raises the question, well, how much can we put confidence in studying the Bible at that level?
I've never come across anything, and I've looked at all of the where those things have been pointed out. Often that comes down to different purposes or perspectives, or it's the limited perspectives of the writers. This is when we talk about the humanity. I've never come across anything that I would describe as blatant in that. In that sense, it's just, it depends on what I'm expecting even, it's like, oh, no, that's fine. I mean, they're different perspectives, and this person sees it from this way and this person sees it from that way.
And to some degree,
that's their understanding and that's their understanding. But the contradiction doesn't pertain, or what is seemingly a contradiction doesn't even really pertain to the main message anyway.
Yeah. Blatant's probably the wrong word, but there were some things that
obvious.
Almost all of the supposed contradictions I look at and go, like, any kind of critical thinking at all tells you that, they're obviously contradicting each other, but you can understand that they're implying different things. It's there's not meant to be a contradiction there. It's like, for example, we're saved by faith, and then later on, some would say that it's by work. And if you don't mean us well, you're trying to critique the Bible, you could bring that out and go, oh, it says here it's by works, and over here it says by faith, sort of, which is it? That's a common criticism. And it's like, well, you just have to spend like literally 30 seconds thinking about it to realize that there is no contradiction.
Yeah, that's right. And that's a good example, because that's, people say, well, James, who says, we're not just saved by faith, but through works. And then Paul that says we're not saved by works, but only through faith. They're actually making quite different. And it's actually really helpful, because they're making points. James wants us to see that faith works. Like, faith is an active, outworking thing, and that the sort of faith that we're saved by is this active faith. So he's making a point that sits. But if you take a critical approach, then it's like, so there were some tensions in the early church, and these represent two polarized theological approaches.
Yeah.
Well, it becomes then a matter of theological judgment, rather than blatant contradiction.
But you don't have to go down that path. I mean, it's easily reconcilable. I understand completely it's not saying that we're saved by works. It's saying that without works, your faith is like any faith that doesn't have works. Is dead. So of course, if there's no works, you're not going to be. What's
the purpose of your faith?
You're not. Yeah. It's completely obvious. Yeah. But if you just take those words and put them up there next to each other, you look at these tables of apparent contradictions, and they go from one. At other places in the Bible, it says that when we're saved, we don't sin anymore. And then the other place it says, well, we do sin. And we're not, our salvation's not really going to be complete until, and obviously we still sin. Yeah. So it's like, well, which is it? We either do or we don't. You can't have it both ways, and it says both things. But again, it's easy to understand those things. You would only attribute meaning of a contradiction if you were trying to attack in some way. And you're being quite disingenuous in that because they're not even theologically complicated to reconcile. Some of the other ones that maybe I'm not sure, like it says in the gospel that about the women who went to the tomb first, they went out and they were the witnesses and they told people that, and then I think it's John that says that they left the tomb and told no one. You know, it's kind of like, it's not a big thing, this has no real doctrinal implication, but it's kind of like, well,
that proves the whole of everything else.
Did they not?
Because the fact is, they're not in a courtroom. John's saying something, like he's making a point for the fact they were so bewildered and so that, yes, initially they didn't tell anyone, you know what I mean? But that doesn't mean they didn't ever tell anyone anytime, you know what I mean? But the interesting thing is a lot of these sorts of things, I mean, even like talking about the resurrection account, you know, one says that they went out when it was dark, another one they said when it was morning, you know what I mean? It's like, hang on, was it like which, but I mean, maybe they left when it was still dark and they got there. So, I mean, honestly, but the interesting thing is, and same with the, you know, with the different accounts of, you know, justification through works and, you know, with James and Paul. And these are all examples that historians now point to as really authenticating the integrity actually of the text, because if this is the product of later generations that wanted to present something pristine, they would have cleaned up all of those things, right? Because the fourfold gospel is referred to in the earliest documents, right? So that had authority right from the beginning, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, right? You see reference to that, you know, in the 2nd century, and so already in a way that clearly portrays the fact that had authority for a long time, those 4 gospels. Now, if it was, those were the product of later, of, you know, 2nd century, you know, fabrications, then the thinking goes they would have cleaned up all of those kind of messy bits, but they didn't. They left it, you know, it's often pointed out they would not have had women as being the first witnesses because in that particular time, no, this is controversial for our time, but unfortunately in the ancient world, women weren't accepted as reliable witnesses in court, right? So they would not have had women as the first witnesses to the, you know, to the empty tomb, and there's all these sorts of things, you know, all of those clunky things. Actually,
they're not trying to hide anything or make anything up.
It's like when police are interviewing, you know, people involved, you know, in a crime. If they're all telling the exact same story and it's just a little bit too identical, then they think, this is a bit of a fabrication. You know, this is all rigged. But if there's slight variations of perspective, which is natural for people looking at the same event from different perspectives with a different interpretive grid, right? Naturally, you're going to have slight differences. And that's a sign not of inauthenticity, but authenticity. And so I think there's another way of looking at that sort of stuff.
That authenticity is sort of reinforced too when you actually look at a lot of atheist scholars, where some people would say just reject things like the resurrection. Some people believe that Jesus himself didn't exist. He was some kind of myth and so on. But, you know, when you actually look at those who aren't necessarily wanting to make Christianity look favourable, the arguments for the resurrection, well, let's start with Jesus. The arguments for the existence of Jesus as described in the Bible are almost indisputable, that that he existed and he did have that there was an impact that there was someone and it really seems like poor scholarship to suggest otherwise. When you go to the resurrection, you can't prove everything, but there's very strong in terms of what is available to us with anything historically from that period. I think most, whether they're not Christian or atheist, acknowledge that there are serious arguments for the resurrection that need to be dealt with. Now, they try to deal with them, but the point is the fact that they've actually got to wrestle with them, and academics are wrestling with these things and trying to find answers and explanations for things, should give us some confidence that it's not just some completely random, totally made up story here. There is some integrity in there. We've got a reason to have some confidence in what's written in there.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me refer listeners to a couple of resources. Well, one in particular that I'm thinking of that covers and summarizes. So when you mentioned the resurrection, I was thinking of the summary that there's a group called Inspiring Philosophy that release YouTube videos that are really well grounded in the sense that they're tapping into the best of biblical scholarship. So it's called Inspiring Philosophy. You can go to their website. They've got these YouTube clips. They do a great one on the resurrection and the evidence for the resurrection, where they summarize, some of the best scholarship available. There's also a series of videos they do on the integrity of the Bible and arguments for taking the Bible seriously from that critical historical perspective. Again, very good set of videos. So
I'll put those links in the notes on the podcast.
Another resource that people can use, Inspiring Philosophy.
Because they do go through at quite an academic level and distill a lot of information down.
Yeah, that's right.
Into a way it's quite easy to consume.
Yeah, so, that's right.
Yeah, I definitely second that.
Well, again, just to finish up, I think we've got to really be careful when because the opening question was, how do we respond to people?
Yeah, that's right.
And we've just got to remember, this is not an abstract issue. This is an issue that comes up when we're talking to people, right? And we've just got to keep calling people into the inside of this, really, because there's a view from the inside that brings a completely different, and very validly brings a completely different perspective, so that we're not just talking about this in terms of this just
object.
Yeah, sort of kind of subject-object approach. And just, encouraging people to discover the truth, recognizing the limitations of what any textual document is really just a gateway to the truth in that sense. Like the truth, truth is can't really be embodied in a text. A text points to the truth. Reality is something that we have to embrace, the reality of God and the reality of the kingdom and what God is doing. This is something that we can have a first-hand experience of as we embrace that and become part of that, even embody that. That's how you discover the truth. And Scripture is God-breathed, as Paul says, all Scripture is God-breathed and useful. Like, that's what he says. It's like a pathway that we can walk on, right? And when we walk on the pathway and when we step through the doorway, so to speak, that's when we discover the truth. So whenever I open up the Bible I'm reading, even if I memorize the Bible, I still would not yet know the truth until I actually did what it says and went where it calls me to go and embrace the God that is embracing me and calling me. And as I respond and as I get in the flow of this thousands of year old, the start of history, when I get into the flow of what God has been and is doing and will continue to do, that's how I really know. And I think we've just got to keep calling people into that. Remember, we are the windows of that reality.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Thrive Perspectives. Our hope is that these discussions will challenge you to look at life from a new perspective. You'll find all our resources at the Thrive Today website, thrivetoday.tv. If there's a topic that you'd like us to discuss, please email us. Our email is contact@thrivetoday.tv. Until next time, our prayer is that you will thrive.